The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television. Major support for Compass is provided by the ongoing support of the Leo P. Flynn Estate of Millbank, South Dakota. Additional support is provided by the Southwest Minnesota Private Industry Council, promoting Southwest Minnesota as a place rich with opportunity. Come for the jobs, stay for the lifestyle. More information at swmnpic.org.
Hello and welcome to Compass, a production of Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass. This is a weekly discussion of public policy and important issues facing our viewing area. This week, part 2 of our interview with former Minnesota Governor Al Quie. Our hosts for this interview segment are Barry Anderson and Robin Wahlberg. Barry Anderson is an Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, and he's also the host of Pioneer's Your Legislators program. For this interview in 2014, Barry was joined by a fellow board member of the Minnesota Supreme Court Historical Society, Robin Wahlberg. Here is part 2 of that interview.
Welcome to an interview with the 35th Governor of the state of Minnesota, the Honorable Albert Quie. This program is brought to you by Pioneer Public Television and by the Minnesota Supreme Court Historical Society. We want to talk a little bit here about the judicial selection and election process. One of the things that you decided as governor was that you were going to approach this differently in terms of how you picked judges. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about how that process happened and what happened there?
Well, when I realized I would have a number of judges to pick, not an attorney, how in the world would I do it? And so I was benefited by Chief Justice Bob Sharon coming down to my office and talked to me about it. And there we talked, and it came that what we ought to do is have a commission that would appoint, or that would nominate some people for judgeships. So they would really evaluate them, and then I could pick out of 3 and make my decision. And I wanted to make sure there was no politics involved in it. And so it had the understanding that this is nonpartisan. And I found out afterwards who people who came in and told me their politics, that they never would have tried to be a judge with a Republican governor if it hadn't been for that. They realized I was a man of my word. And other people said if I had to run for office, they never would have done it too. So the quality went up. And Randy Kelly then introduced the legislation to make it law, what I had done before, a few years before that. And so that's law. And we did not put the Supreme Court in there because we didn't know how that would work, or the Court of Appeals then later. And I wish now we had put the whole works in there. But a lot of governors have used that same commission for their appointment for the appellate system too.
Many of our viewers may not be aware of Chief Justice Sharon's accomplishments. He served previously as an Associate Justice and appointed as Chief Justice, long record of public service in Minnesota, but also very much in his earlier partisan days, a Democrat. Yeah. Did that factor into your conversations with the Chief Justice at all?
No, I judged him on what he said, what he was attempting to do, and I didn't think that there's any ulterior motives on his part for that, because if it was ulterior motives, I suppose you could give it over to the legislature to appoint in doing that. But he proved it again when he left office. He came down and see me. He said, I want you to know I'm going to retire early so you can appoint me. He had that much confidence that I would pick a person who was really honorable and respectable. And so Doug Amdahl became the next Chief Justice.
So let's talk a little bit about your Supreme Court appointments. You had two, as I recall. And Simonette, I guess 3, I'm sorry. Yes, yes. Can you tell us a little bit about, maybe about both those appointments, Justice Coyne and Chief Justice Amdahl?
Amdahl, I mean, he was so highly regarded, and he came before the people who advised me and all. And let me tell you just something here. The Republican Party was upset with me what I did. And the way I brought them to my side was, if I only picked Republicans and you did something wrong, you would like a Republican judge to go before. But if you were in the right, you'd want a fair and impartial judge no matter what his party was. They understood that. And so Judge Simonette came along, and so I was looking at him and all, and she claims she doesn't remember it, but his wife wrote me a letter and told me what a tremendous person he was. and I figured, man, if his wife thinks that much of him, he must be pretty good.
And then Justice Coyne, you appointed Justice Coyne as well. Tell us a little bit about her.
Well, I was only getting men as a recommendation and the nomination. And so I said, I want you to be sure you have at least one woman. And so I said, tell me, who is the best woman lawyer in the state of Minnesota? And they came up with the name Jean Coyne. And so I asked Jean to come in and see if she would apply. And she said, no, she didn't want to do that. And I said, I'm going to ask you as a favor to let your name be considered. And I don't know how she felt about that, but you know, it could be, well, he needs a woman on there, so it looks right. And so, I mean, she was obviously the best person appointed. And so she's the only one that I asked when I appointed them to give me a promise. I said, I want you to promise not to leave the court till you get the age mandatory retirement.
And any particular reason for asking that promise?
Well, some people go on and they're on for a while, and if they're really good, we lose that person. Mm-hmm. It's just like in the shorter mandatory short term, say 6 years or even 12 years for Congress. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we lose some awfully good people. So I looked around Congress and I thought, I didn't think anybody who was there over 20 years ought to be there, but there's a lot of others they gained in seniority. So that's why. So I figured, with her, she would not get beyond the stage where she'd get dottery, and so that's why. When you have a good person, and I just want to make sure that wasn't going to happen.
There are, of course, many options out there for ways to select judges. But one of the options that you did not favor and did not sign on to was the minority report that called for a federal model for state elections. Mm-hmm. In other words, appointment, confirmation, either long terms or lifetime terms. Instead, your approach was more along the line of retention elections. Can you tell our viewers why you land where you do on that spectrum of independence versus impartiality?
Well, for 21 years, I watched the United States Senate with judicial appointments. And you think you're getting away from politics on that, you're fooling yourself. And before the legislature, to see them, you know, bring their political power on whether this person should be confirmed or not, and on both sides. Can you imagine if the Minnesota State Senate had gone like the House this time, and we had that, Mark Dayton still be a governor? Think of the difficulty he would have had. You know, as a Republican say, well, what difference does that make? But if it was just reverse that, if a Republican governor would have difficult time he would have if he was like when I came in and the DFL controlled both bodies of the legislature. You know, it just doesn't work. Politics is rampant in the legislative bodies. It's supposed to be. But sure it is, it uses the political parties to do it, but amongst the people of the country, we trust people who know what they're doing. We gave them the vote. That is what we're about in this nation, trusting people when by giving them the information and then let them vote on it.
Before we get to the Commission for the Preservation of an Impartial Judiciary, but before we get to that, I just want to touch very briefly on your appointment of Doug Amdahl as Chief Justice.
Well, he just came so overwhelmingly recommended that you couldn't help but pay attention to him. And then in the interview I had with him, I was confident he would be fair and impartial. And I never knew his politics at all, never inquired about it. And afterwards, I was surely glad that I did, both of the appointing him first and then appointing him Chief Justice.
So let's talk about the Citizens Commission for the Preservation of an Impartial Judiciary, otherwise known as the Quay Commission. Tell our viewers a little bit about how you happened to get involved in that process.
You hadn't appointed all the people yet, and so we did the appointment system very fairly. You took organized labor, the corporations and business, Republican Party, DFL Party, district appellate and Supreme Court members on that, and various organizations on that too who were involved with this. Now, one of the parts of it, when we came to the retention elections and the evaluation, then we went to the way that we would use retention elections for all of them, and looking at the various states, that would be the case. And then we also, now what's the fairest way that you can do the evaluation? And that was to divide the evaluation group into 3 parts, and the governor would appoint 8 of the 24, and the chair, the majority leader, and the speaker, and the minority leader, and both bodies would then pick the 8 of them, and then the Supreme Court itself would pick 8 of them. So the ones who people have elected to go to office and that, the bipartisanship would be there, because no matter how the election turned out, there would be both from the legislature, both sides from the legislature represented. And since the governor makes the appointments, he ought to have some voice on who's evaluating them. So that's what we did.
What was the problem you were trying to address? In other words, why did the Quay Commission even come into being, and why were you doing all this work, thinking about how we should select judges?
The courts had ruled that nobody could speak on political or legal issues when they ran for the job as a judge or a justice. And Greg Wursel took that all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that if you're going to have contested elections, people ought to be able to talk about political or judicial questions that come up before them. And so that's what we were faced with. And then as the judges looked at this and see, what are they going to be thrown into partisan and hostile elections more than they have. So I think that's what spurred the Supreme Court members to decide, let's have a commission study this and see if we can't do something that now is even better than that Clause 5, I believe it was.
Governor Quay, looking back at your time in the state legislature, in the U.S. Congress, and as governor, your reputation is one of a bipartisan leader, of a moderate kind of bent. And my question is, what are some of the key moments in those institutions where it really showed that you were able to lead in a bipartisan manner?
There was one guy, John Bradamus from Indiana, who we would just battled each other on these issues, just battled each other. We were on TV together, battling each other. And here's how extreme that became. There was an early childhood education bill that went through our committee 34-1. I was the one voting against it. And John said, Mr. Chairman, I'm pulling this bill. I'm not going to the floor without Al Quay. And he came, and it was the involvement with the parents that I was talking to. We made the change. That's the kind of relationship, but it comes from looking into each other's eyes. So when you in all facilities and everything, you arrange them so you look into each other's eyes. Because we communicate so much non-verbally in that way.
What's ahead for Governor Quie in terms of public policy and issues that you're concerned about?
The worst crime we commit are the kids who don't achieve at school. That's about half of our kids. But it's such a high percentage of people of color. That is wrong. Now, there's some efforts, but I just yesterday was to a meeting, and they said the needle on achievement has not moved in 25 years. Well, I know. I watched the needle come down for the 25 years before that, and was horrified by it. And there's one way that we can solve that, and that is every teacher of elementary school children go to the locale of the parents. I mean, it's radical. I'd say, like they did in Ramsey County with welfare workers in the 1930s, actually stay overnight, dinner, sleep, and breakfast with the family so they get to know them. And because when you look at caregivers and everything like that, the parent still spends more time with a child during a week than any caregiver does. So that interaction is there. And when you look at the child carrying the DNA of both the father and the mother, and when the mother is providing all of the protection and nourishment for the child in those first months, first year, the child and the mother come into sync with each other. That is, you hardly could use words about it. That's what needs to be captured by the teachers, and they're taught how to do that.
Governor, thank you for your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, the 35th Governor of the state of Minnesota, Albert Quie.
That's it for this week on Compass. Thanks to Barry Anderson and Robin Waldberg for hosting this conversation with former Minnesota Governor Al Quie. Our Compass producer, Laura K. Prosser, will take it from here and end this week's episode with the next installment of the Compass Literature Corner. Thanks for watching.
As part of the new segment to the show called the Compass Literature Corner, we will be talking to local authors and writers who have had an impact on this region or whom this region has had an impact on. Today we have a man who spent his summers near Maynard, Minnesota, but also a man who knows the importance of getting everyone's side of the story, which he does in his latest book. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to say that today's guest is mystery author Vincent Wyckoff. Vincent, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write your book, Black Otter Bay.
Well, Black Otter Bay is set up on the North Shore, and I moved up there on the North Shore of Lake Superior in the mid-1970s when Judge Miles Lord shut down Reserve Mining Company. I got out of the service, and I moved up there. I worked construction for several years, and I got to know a lot of the local people. I worked with them, I hunted with them, I fished with them. I so admired the personalities and characters, strong characters to live up there. Pretty brutal weather conditions. I live in Minneapolis now, but those experiences always stayed with me. And I always thought if I could write something, I would like to set it up there. That area, that place, and those people meant so much to me that it was just a logical decision to go there with the story.
Tell us a little bit about what the book is about. It's set in Duluth, and
it's set up on the North Shore, about 50 miles out of Duluth. There is some action that takes place in Duluth and in Canal Park, but mostly it's up on the shore. And it's near a town, the real-life town of Beaver Bay.
Mm-hmm. I know that town well.
You do? Okay. That's near where I lived. And I changed the name of it because I put a sheriff's office in town, which there is no sheriff's office in Beaver Bay. But it's a really, the office in my book is a pretty interesting, it's got a backstory, it's a stone and timber building. The post office is different in town, and I just thought instead of having people coming back afterwards and saying, well, that's not what Beaver Bay looks like, just change the name. There's an area up there called Palisade Head, and there's part of the action with Marcy and Abby. They're hiking along the shoreline, and they're right in the area where Palisade Head is, and I wanted to have the tall cliffs and everything, but I needed them to walk through there. So they walked through, and I just changed the name to the Ramparts, so instead of Palisade. So I changed some of the names. I didn't change too many names in Duluth. I didn't use names. There's the art gallery in Canal Park that some people will say, well, that's the Sievertson Gallery. It's pretty much based on that, but I call it the Tempest. But up on the shore, everything is fictionalized, even though it's based on a real place where I lived.
Wonderful.
And the characters are people that I knew.
And they say, you know, write what you know, right?
Exactly.
And you knew the characters, you knew the location. What was it like for you writing from a perspective of a teenager?
Well, it was interesting, and my process for writing a story is the characters tell me the story. So when I started writing it, my intention was to put a child in danger, and that would engage the reader. Oh, what's going to happen? So I started writing about a 13-year-old boy, and I know 13-year-old boys. I was one. He's fishing on this lake shore, and I know fishing. And I'm telling the story and describing the location and setting where we are, and it just wasn't coming. And I kept working at it and trying to push through it, and then it occurred to me that, you know what, this isn't a 13-year-old boy, it's a 13-year-old girl. And I went back and tried to rework it, and all of a sudden she's wearing a Minnesota Twins cap, she's got a long black braid, and she's telling me this story.
More of a tomboy telling
More of
you
a
story.
tomboy. She really loves her fishing, and so she starts telling me the story. And having the characters tell the story for me is important. I can use an example from later in the book where Marcy decides to go with Abby to Duluth. Most adults would say this was a very irresponsible thing to do. Mm-hmm. If I'm the omniscient narrator telling the story, I'm going to have a hard time convincing the reader that this is plausible. Yeah. But when I tell that chapter and that part of the story from the perspective of Marcy, when she's explaining it, we understand better what her motivations are, what her connections and attachments and love for Abby, this girl. We understand all these things much better than a regular narrator could do. It's coming from Marcy, and she is explaining not only to Abby but to herself and then the reader why she's going to do this. And I think it just works so much better. It gives it so much more life and depth, but more feeling to the story.
So tell me a little bit about what kind of background or layout work goes into creating a mystery novel from all these different perspectives.
That's a great question, and every writer has their own process. I don't have that sort of a process. I don't outline. As I said earlier, my intention was to engage the reader with a young person in danger. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know that there was going to be a murder. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just started talking about this boy, and then it became a girl. And then the story starts coming out. We meet the sheriff, and he's adding to the story. The postmistress adds a lot to the story. Just moving around. So I don't know what's going to happen. And to me, that makes it much more exciting to write. Every day I would sit down and, wow, okay, okay, Abby, here we go, and tell me what's going to happen. So it's much more exciting. I think if I had an outline, it's a little bit more like journalism. I have a lot of respect for journalists and journalism, but it's a little bit boring. For me, I would rather not know. It's more exciting, and I can keep a little bit edgier as I'm writing that way.
That's very true. This is not your first book. This is the second book. Right. So as part of our last question, why don't you tell us why you decided to go from a nonfiction short story form to a long novel fiction piece?
Right. Well, I've always wanted to write novels. It's been a dream of mine. I finally got to a point in my life where I could. My previous book, Beware of Cat and Other Encounters of a Letter Carrier, told about my career delivering the mail. And they were real stories of real people in our neighborhood. It's nonfiction, but I got to practice writing and working with the craft. I wrote stories along with that, always with the intention of someday writing a novel. So I was able to branch out into this, and I'm writing a sequel, and this is where it's going for me. I love it.
Well, if our viewers want to pick up your book, they can find it on Amazon, at the Barnes & Noble website. Where else can they find it?
The publisher, NorthstarPress.com, is a good place to get it, and actually right in Milan, the gift shop. I think it's Billy Mapletree, right in downtown Milan. She has copies of it. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Vince.
Thank you, Laura. This has been really fun.
Thanks. That's it for us in the Literature Corner. Please tune in next week for more people, places, and issues facing our viewing area. I'm Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser, and may your compass always point you in the direction of a good book.
Major support for Compass is provided by the ongoing support of the Leo P. Flynn Estate of Millbank, South Dakota. Additional support is provided by the Southwest Minnesota Private Industry Council, promoting Southwest Minnesota as a place rich with opportunity. Come for the jobs, stay for the lifestyle. More information at swmnpic.org.